Welcome to this explainer. Today we're tackling one of the most fascinating and, frankly, contradictory figures of the 20th century. Picture this. It's the bitter cold winter of 1924, and the Russian people are amid a massive outpouring of grief because Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is dead. This was the man who literally willed the Soviet Union into existence. But his legacy presents us with a massive historical paradox. How exactly does a leader set out to achieve this beautiful, utopian vision of social justice, but do so through, well, ruthlessly violent and oppressive means? It's a really complex puzzle, and we're going to break it down together. Let's dive in.
To really understand Lenin's mindset, you have to look at how he forced himself to suppress his own compassion. He actually once told a friend that listening to music made him want to say sweet nonsense and stroke people's heads. But he wouldn't let himself do it. Listen to this. You can't stroke anyone's head today. Now you have to beat them on the head. Beat them without mercy. Just wow. To him, the revolution wasn't some polite political debate, right? It was a brutal war that required absolute severity. Getting soft simply wasn't an option.
Section 1. Forging a fanatical revolutionary. So Lenin was born into a pretty prosperous family in 1870. But the absolute catalyst for him, that happened in 1887 when his older brother Alexander was hanged for plotting to assassinate the Tsar. After the execution, friends and neighbors entirely ostracized his grieving family. This betrayal completely hardened Lenin's heart against Russian society, leaving him with this burning desire to just tear the whole system down.
Now, as he grew older, Lenin leaned heavily into the writings of Karl Marx. But here's the thing, he interpreted Marx with a terrifying literalness. You know that famous phrase, dictatorship of the proletariat? Marx didn't necessarily mean that as an absolute brutal autocracy, but Lenin, he absolutely did. For him, this definition was an explicit playbook. It meant systematically stripping the upper and middle classes of their vote and civil rights and severely punishing any sign of opposition using state terror.
Moving on to organizing the Bolshevik vanguard. Lenin spent years bouncing between prison, Siberia, and exile. And honestly, he got entirely sick of revolutionaries who just sat around talking. So, in his famous 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done, he laid out a totally new strategy. Don't wait for the masses. Instead, organize a small, elite vanguard of professional revolutionaries to command the uprising.
To lead this new army, he created the Bolsheviks, and their mission statement was incredibly intense. Destroy the opponent, wipe his organization off the face of the earth. And Lenin actually lived this fanaticism every single day. He was highly strong and maintained this incredibly Spartan, regimented existence. Get this, he was so intensely fussy about his desk that he never left it without making sure all his pencils were freshly sharpened for the next day. If anyone moved a pencil, big trouble. Everything had to be strictly ordered so he could pour literally every ounce of his energy into the revolution.
Which brings us to a critical moment, seizing power in 1917. It really took the absolute devastation of World War I to finally break the old Tsarist regime. By early 1917, the Russian economy was collapsing, thrusting the country into this chaotic dual power struggle between a scrambling provisional government and the newly formed councils of workers and soldiers, known as the Soviets. Things moved at breakneck speed here. In February, a women's march for bread triggers massive military mutinies. By March, the Tsar abdicates. But Lenin? He's stuck in exile in Switzerland. He needs to cross enemy territory, so he pragmatically cuts a deal with the Germans. They give him safe passage and funding, basically hoping he'll go back and knock Russia out of the war. Talk about pragmatic, he takes the enemy's money to fund his own revolution. He rolls into Petrograd in April, and by October, he's orchestrating a full-on Bolshevik seizure of power.
And he pulled it off through sheer force of personality. In October, other Bolshevik leaders were kind of hesitating, wanting to wait for a peaceful transition of power. But Lenin sneaks back into Petrograd in disguise and demands immediate armed revolution. He warns them, history will not forgive us if we miss this moment. His uncanny sense of timing pushed them right over the edge. Red Guards march into the Winter Palace, and virtually bloodlessly, they overthrow the provisional government right at the 11th hour.
But hey, winning power is one thing, right? Keeping it is a whole different ballgame. Let's look at pragmatism, power, and terror. Before taking over, the Bolsheviks promised democratic elections for a constituent assembly, but they ended up getting less than a quarter of the public vote. Because democracy wasn't exactly serving his goal, Lenin let this elected assembly meet for exactly one day and then literally sent in the guards to shut it down forever.
This really exposes the jarring disconnect of his rule. On one hand,
You had these incredibly popular slogans that won over the masses: peace, land, and bread. Beautiful, simple, effective. But on the other hand, the immediate reality once he seized power was secret police, press censorship, and state terror. Lenin very quickly adopted the exact same brutal mechanisms the old Tsars used, just to enforce his new utopian vision.
If you want a glimpse into the deeply brutal psychology beneath that utopian thought, read this chilling order he wrote regarding wealthy peasants, known as kulaks, who were accused of hoarding grain. Hang no fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men, bloodsuckers. Do it in such a way that for hundreds of kilometers around the people might see, tremble, know, yours, Lenin. It is a stark reminder that he viewed state terror as a perfectly legitimate administrative tool.
But remember, Lenin was also incredibly pragmatic when his survival depended on it. To get out of World War I and save his fragile new government, he forced his reluctant party to swallow staggering losses in the 1918 peace treaty with Germany. We're talking giving up 33% of Russian territory, 50% of its industrial resources, and its vital Ukrainian breadbasket. It was an incredibly bitter pill, but his pragmatism told him that without peace, the entire revolution would be wiped out.
Now that peace treaty triggered a devastating multi-year civil war. After the Red Army ultimately defeated the White Army around 1921, Russia was essentially destroyed, and millions were starving. So what does the ultimate hardline communist do? He pragmatically retreats to state capitalism. He opened up markets and allowed private industry just to get the economy breathing again and appease the peasant majority. He was willing to compromise his core economic ideology just to keep the state alive.
But his relentless drive eventually caught up with him. Let's look at Lenin's final warning. By 1922, the newly named USSR was forming, but the 52-year-old leader suffered a series of severe strokes. He was forced into this frustrating semi-retirement, watching helplessly from the sidelines as the state he built began to solidify.
From his sickbed, he dictated what became known as his last testament. And the most crucial point here is his evaluation of his potential successors. He criticized pretty much all of them, but he specifically singled out a man who was quietly amassing massive power as General Secretary, Joseph Stalin. Lenin explicitly begged his inner circle to replace Stalin, realizing he was far too dangerous. But tragically, the inner circle ignored this final warning. That fatal misstep leads us to a dark, complex legacy. Following Lenin's death, Stalin violently consolidated power. He launched decades of purges, created the vast Gulag slave labor system, and forced devastating agricultural collectivization, all in the name of Lenin's revolution. You know, a lot of people try to separate Lenin's golden revolution from Stalin's dark age. But as the historical sources show, there is a very direct line. What is the actual structural legacy of Leninism? Well, he founded the one-party state. He created the military vanguard concept. He passed on the doctrine of state terror. He chose dictatorship over democracy. That wasn't just Stalinism. That was the bedrock of Leninism that he bequeathed to his successor, and it inspired authoritarian regimes for decades to come.
So, what should we really take away from this explainer? Many people still admire Lenin's initial goals, the desire to create equality, empower working people, and build a society of social justice. But his story leaves us with a profound and haunting question, one I want to leave you with today. Is it ever possible to create good things through bad means? Does the unimaginable brutality he unleashed ultimately corrupt and taint the utopia he was trying to build? It's a heavy thought for sure, but an absolutely essential one for understanding history. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpacked this incredible and harrowing chapter. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.